There are houses that belong to cities, and then there are houses that belong to towns. This one stands in Caro, Michigan. Not Detroit, not Grand Rapids, not Chicago, Caro. A place that most people pass through without ever realizing what it once was. But in the early years of the 20th century, this was not a quiet place. This was a town with rail lines, with industry, with agricultural processing plants, with capital moving through it. And someone here, someone who believed in permanence, built this. Because houses like this don't rise quietly. They don't appear by accident. They are deliberate. They are declarations. And to understand this house, we have to understand the man who built it. Before we talk about William James Moore, we need to talk about Caro, because context changes everything. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Michigan was transforming. Railroads stitched the state together. Agriculture industrialized. Small towns became economic engines. Caro was positioned strategically in Tuscola County. Rail access meant mobility. Mobility meant trade. And trade meant capital. One of the major economic drivers of the region was the sugar beet industry. Processing plants rose near rail lines. Farmers diversified. Seasonal labor arrived. Money circulated. And when money begins circulating in a town, architecture changes. Porches widen. Brick replaces wood. Second stories appear. Formal rooms multiply. And occasionally, a house rises above the rest. At the turn of the century, building a substantial brick residence in a town like Caro was not modest. It was confident. It said, I believe in this place. I expect stability. My future is here. And that mindset is exactly what this house reflects. But who was the man bold enough to build it? William James Moore was born August 21st, 1870, in Ontario, Canada. He moved with his family to Michigan in 1875. His father was a lumberman, and at an early age, Moore developed an interest that would define his life: telephones. His cousin was Elisha Gray, one of the early pioneers of telephone technology. Elisha Gray famously filed a patent application on the same day as Alexander Graham Bell. He lost the race by hours. Moore grew up adjacent to invention, and instead of watching history unfold, he stepped into it. While attending Oberlin College and later business school in Saginaw, he spent his spare time designing telephone apparatus. In 1896, he was issued U.S. patent number 579003 for a telephone transmitter that he perfected. But Moore did not stop at inventing. He built infrastructure. In 1892, he established the Moore Telephone Manufacturing Company to build equipment, and the Moore Telephone System to operate exchanges. This was strategic. Bell's patents dominated the national system. Independent operators had to innovate around them. Moore did exactly that. By the early 1900s, the Moore telephone system had built more than 20 exchanges in Michigan. Subscribers grew from just 10 in 1892 to approximately 2,500 by 1947. At one point, the company employed around 30 people and grossed about $5,000 per month. Relocate his operations there. They weren't recruiting a hobbyist. They were recruiting infrastructure, and Caro became his headquarters. He would serve as president of the Moore telephone system until 1947, when leadership transitioned to his son, Andrew J. Moore. He remained involved in a consulting capacity until his death in 1955. But Moore was not just a telephone executive. He was a civic leader. He became the largest stockholder and director of the State Savings Bank of Caro. He led real estate ventures. He helped found the Caro Chamber of Commerce in 1922. He was a member of the Telephone Pioneers of America and the Independent Telephone Association of America. And then there were the automobiles. In 1899, Moore imported a De Dion Bouton automobile from France. It became the first horseless carriage in the thumb of Michigan. Before Ford mass production, before Detroit became Motor City, Moore was already driving one. Local accounts suggest that he brought the car to Detroit during the earliest years of the auto industry. What we know for certain is this: he loved machines. In 1914, he commissioned a custom Cadillac Model 51 V8 built to his specifications. It was advanced, luxurious, and ahead of its time. That Cadillac now resides in the Lauwman Museum in The Hague, Netherlands, a global artifact with origins in Caro, Michigan. Moore raced cars, experimented with technology, designed mechanical systems. He was a gadgeteer, a mechanical tinkerer, and nowhere did that mindset appear more clearly than in his home. In 1914, Moore purchased the residence at 123 North Almer Street in Caro. Then he transformed it. In 1917, he built a large swimming pool on the property. From 1923 to 1927, he remodeled the home into a custom Tudor Revival storybook design. Cedar siding, stone columns, chimneys, rolled-edged roofing with hidden gutters. But the real distinction was inside. Moore wired the house with more than 20 telephones. You could place a call from nearly every room, including the garage. There was a master control panel in the foyer. He installed a hidden burglar alarm, accessible by secret latch that could lock exterior doors instantly. He engineered remote-controlled motorized doors. The garage featured an advanced pulley system. Nearly a century before the phrase smart home existed, W.J. Moore built, well, exactly that. Outside, the grounds were just as ambitious. Full-grown trees were transplanted using equipment that he designed. There were formal gardens, an aquatic garden, fruit trees, a Japanese bridge over the swimming pool, a stone lighthouse feature, and a mechanical trapeze that allowed someone to swing from the house balcony into the pool. Tall light poles with concealed bulbs, topped by martin birdhouses, illuminated the property. The tennis court could be used at night. This wasn't decoration. This was engineering. This was a laboratory disguised as a residence. To understand this house, you have to understand the mindset of 1900. America believed in expansion. Industry was scaling, Agriculture was modernizing, and infrastructure was spreading. The prevailing belief was simple: the future will be larger than the past. When a culture believes that, architecture changes. Homes grow taller. Materials become permanent. Foundations grow thicker. The W.J. Moore House assumes continuity. It assumes prosperity. It assumes stability. It was built before the Great Depression, before global wars reshaped economies, before rural contraction. It was built in the bright space before the test, and optimism leaves fingerprints. You see it in the scale, in the brick, in the wiring, in the willingness to experiment. This house does not feel cautious. It feels assured. This house has stood for more than a century, through economic swings, through generational change, through shifting taste. But permanence is never automatic. It requires intention. And today, we're partnering with the current owners to help preserve it, not as a static relic, not as a frozen artifact, but as a living structure with a future. The long-term vision, careful restoration, thoughtful interpretation, and if all goes as planned, one day allowing this home to function as a living museum. Because houses like this are not just private property. They are cultural memory. They carry the fingerprints of ambition, of optimism, of small-town belief in permanence. And once they're gone, they don't come back. This house was built with an assumption that it would outlive the man who built it, that it would anchor a family, anchor a street, anchor a town. And for more than a century, it has. The question now is not whether it was important. The question is whether we still treat it that way. I'm Chris Hubble. This is Homes of Michigan. Season 3 begins here. And the story of the W.J. Moore House is just getting started.